The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the aisles of Thompson's Hardware, a small, family-owned store that had been a staple of the neighborhood for years. The shelves were neatly stocked with tools, paints, and garden supplies, each item carefully placed, waiting to be sold. It was a place where people from the neighborhood would stop by to pick up everything from a hammer to a bag of mulch, a place where, despite the times, the atmosphere remained simple, no frills, and welcoming. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open, signaling the arrival of the store's next customer. Jack Miller stepped inside, a familiar presence in the small town. He was a man of routine, in his mid-50s, with a weathered face that spoke of decades of life. Some of it spent on the front lines as a military veteran, much of it spent on quiet reflection after his retirement. His steps were steady, his frame broad but slightly bent, a body accustomed to the weight of both age and experience. He had been a Marine for over 20 years, and now, in civilian life, he wore his patriotism proudly, often seen with a faded red MAGA hat perched atop his head. Jack didn't see the hat as a symbol of division. To him, it represented something far more personal, a return to values that he believed in, a chance for the country to regain its strength and pride. It was a symbol of hope, of a future that looked different than the present, and a reminder of the struggles he'd faced while serving. To him, the hat wasn't about politics. It was about identity, pride in his country, and the service he had given. The store was quiet that morning, save for the low murmur of a few customers going about their business. Jack moved slowly down the aisles, his fingers brushing over the familiar products he had used over the years. He wasn't in a rush today. He was just here to pick up some screws for a project he had started at home. The kind of simple task that most people would think little of. But for Jack, it was the kind of day that made him feel connected to the world around him. As he reached for a pack of screws on the top shelf, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Can I help you with something, sir?" It was a young woman's voice, coming from the end of the aisle. He turned to see a young woman, barely out of her 20s, wearing the standard blue apron of the store. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and there was a noticeable sense of purpose in her stride as she made her way toward him. He smiled warmly, offering her a friendly nod. "Just grabbing some screws. Nothing too complicated." Her eyes flicked down to the hat, and Jack saw the subtle shift in her expression, the way her posture stiffened just a little. He'd seen that look before, a look that seemed to appear whenever someone saw the red MAGA hat on his head. To Jack, it had always been a symbol of pride, but to others, he knew it could evoke feelings of discomfort, confusion, even anger. Jack's jaw tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He had heard this before, the idea that the MAGA hat was a symbol of hatred, that it represented the worst aspects of a divided country. But for Jack, that couldn't be further from the truth. The hat wasn't about hate, it wasn't about division, it was about the struggles of the working class, about the desire to see his country strong again, about the people he had served alongside and fought for. He stood taller now, his expression hardening. "You don't know me. You don't know what this hat means to me." The woman crossed her arms, her stance firm but not aggressive. "And you don't know what it means to others," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "I can't serve someone who supports what that hat stands for, not when it represents so much pain for so many people." Jack felt his heart rate increase, a mix of frustration and sadness rising within him. He had fought for this country, put his life on the line, and now here he was, standing in a store, his own town, being told that he wasn't welcome because of a symbol that, to him, meant something completely different. "I fought for the right to wear whatever I want, for the right to stand for something," he said, his voice low but steady. "And you're telling me I'm not welcome here because of this?" He motioned to the hat, the words feeling heavier now, like a weight on his chest. "That's the world we're living In now?" The woman opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, an older man in the aisle turned to look at them. He had been listening to the exchange, and now his voice carried a quiet authority. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone even but firm. Jack turned toward him, and the man's gaze moved from Jack's face to the hat and back again. The older man looked between Jack and the young woman for a long moment before he spoke again. "Everyone deserves respect," the older man said, "even if we don't agree with everything they stand for." The woman shifted uncomfortably at the older man's words, but she didn't back down. "I know. I can't ignore what that hat has come to mean in today's world." Jack sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I just want to buy my screws and go home. But I guess that's asking too much now." The silence between them grew heavier, each person standing their ground. Jack couldn't help but feel the sting of rejection, not just from the woman but from the world that seemed so divided. "I didn't want to cause trouble," Jack said, his voice softer now. "But I don't understand how we got here. How a simple hat became something that divides us so deeply." The woman hesitated, the anger in her eyes giving way to uncertainty. She didn't know what to say to that. How could she explain it all to him? How could she make him see her side when he couldn't see hers? "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice less certain now, the tension in her stance easing just a little. "I'm sorry if I made you feel like you don't belong here." But the words felt like they weren't enough. They didn't fix the wound, didn't solve the divide. Jack stood there for a moment longer, his eyes lingering on the young woman, but he didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the pack of screws and turned to walk toward the counter. Jack took a deep breath as he moved toward the counter. The sound of his boots echoed in the stillness of the store, the rhythm of his steps like the ticking of a clock, marking the weight of the moment. He walked slowly, deliberately, but his mind was racing. The interaction, though brief, had left him unsettled, and a part of him wasn't sure how to move forward. The older man, who had been observing the situation, followed Jack to the counter. He didn't say anything more, but his presence felt like an unspoken attempt at diffusing the tension, a reminder that there were still people in this world who understood the importance of respect, even in moments of disagreement. Jack placed the pack of screws on the counter, his hand hovering over the surface for a moment before he finally looked up at the woman again. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe an apology or a more understanding glance. But all he saw was a young woman trying to reconcile her beliefs with the reality of the situation. The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously to the older man behind Jack. Her fingers brushed against the register, and she looked back at Jack with a small, almost apologetic frown. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you pay for that right now," she said quietly. Jack cut her off, his voice firm but not angry. "I'm just trying to buy some screws. I don't want to fight, but this isn't right." The woman looked away, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She wanted to do what was right, but she wasn't sure what that was anymore. Should she be standing up for her beliefs, as she had been taught to do, or was she overstepping? Was it right to refuse service to someone just because of what they wore? Her thoughts were interrupted by the older man's voice, low and calm. "You know, when I was your age, I'd never have thought that something as simple as a hat could cause such a mess," he said, his tone almost nostalgic. "We fought for things that mattered back then. Freedom, respect, honor. But now it's like we're just fighting each other." The woman's eyes softened as she looked at the older man. She understood where he was coming from, but the divide between them felt too deep, too real to bridge in just a few moments. Jack was right, in a way. This wasn't about the hat. It wasn't even about politics, though it had become that. It was about what the hat represented to each of them, and how those representations had come to define their interactions with the world. She looked at Jack again, her eyes searching his face for something, anything, that could give her clarity. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. I don't want to support what I feel that hat stands for." Jack's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the hurt didn't fade. He had been patient, trying to understand, but the words still stung. He was a veteran, a man who had fought for his country, for his freedom, for people he didn't know. He wasn't a villain, wasn't the symbol of hate that others saw him as. He was just a man trying to move through life as best as he could. "I wore that hat because I want to feel proud again," Jack said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I want to feel like this country is strong again, that we still have something to believe in. And when I put it on, I feel like maybe there's a chance for that. But I'm not here to hurt anyone." The woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. It wasn't that she didn't hear him, it was that she didn't know how to reconcile his words with the things she had learned, the things she had been taught. The divide was too wide for a simple conversation to heal, and the tension was still thick in the air. "I hear you," she said quietly. "But that doesn't change what I feel. And that's the hard part." Jack stood there for a moment, considering her words. The silence between them was palpable. He wasn't sure what to do next, how to resolve this. It wasn't a matter of being right or wrong. It wasn't about whether he wore the hat or whether she believed it stood for something different. It was about their inability to see eye to eye, their inability to bridge the gap between their experiences and their ideals. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice low but resolute. "You don't have to agree with me," he said, "but we've got to find a way to live with each other, to listen to each other, because this—" He gestured to the store, to the world outside. "This isn't the way forward. We're all just people trying to make sense of it." The woman looked at him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she felt the weight of his words. They weren't easy words to hear, and they didn't make the situation any less complicated, but they did make her think. "I don't have an answer," she admitted, her voice small. "But maybe we can start by talking more. Really talking, not just judging." Jack smiled softly, a faint glimmer of understanding passing between them. "I'd like that," he said, nodding once. The older man, who had been standing quietly behind them, spoke up again, his voice carrying a quiet wisdom. "Sometimes the hardest thing is just to talk, but it's the only way we'll ever understand each other." Jack picked up the pack of screws and placed them on the counter. He looked at the woman, his expression still thoughtful, but with a hint of respect in his eyes. "I'll pay for these," he said quietly. As he handed over the money, the woman looked down, still unsure of what to do with the emotions swirling inside her, but she accepted the payment without another word. There was no magic resolution, no quick fix to the divide that had come between them, but, for a brief moment, there was a sense of shared humanity, a quiet understanding of the struggles both sides had faced. Jack turned to leave, his steps slower this time, the weight of the conversation still hanging between them. The bell above the door jingled again as he walked out into the cool evening air, the world outside feeling no less complicated but, for the first time that day, a little less heavy. The woman stood behind the counter, watching him go. She didn't have the answers. She wasn't sure there were any answers to find. But she had learned something today, something important, something that might not change the world, but might change the way she looked at it. The sound of Jack's footsteps faded as he disappeared into the quiet evening, leaving the woman standing behind the counter, her mind still processing the conversation. She took a deep breath and ran a hand through her hair, wiping the nervous sweat from her brow. The store was now almost empty, save for a few lingering customers, but the atmosphere felt different, charged in a way she hadn't anticipated. There was a weight to the air, like the unresolved tension between her and Jack was still hanging there, lingering in the corners of the room. As the final customer paid and left, she was left alone in the stillness of the store. She leaned against the counter, her eyes drifting to the register, her fingers lightly tapping against the surface. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, the conversation with Jack still echoing in her mind. She had stood her ground, yes. She had refused to serve him, just as she felt she needed to. But as the minutes passed, she began to question whether that had been the right choice. She had acted on principle, believing that what he represented, the symbol on his hat, was something dangerous, something that went against everything she stood for. But was it possible that she had been too quick to judge? Her heart ached slightly as she thought about the words Jack had said. "We're all just people trying to make sense of it." It was simple, yet it carried a truth she hadn't fully considered. She had been so focused on her own beliefs, on the things she had read, the things she had heard, that she hadn't stopped to ask herself whether she had been missing the larger picture. Maybe it wasn't about the hat. Maybe it was about the person who wore it, the experiences, the history, the reasons behind it. Her gaze fell to the counter, where she could still see the faint outline of the payment Jack had made for the screws. She hadn't expected him to come back and pay, honestly. She had thought that the moment would end with him walking out, leaving her to process the failure of what had transpired. But he hadn't. He'd come back. He had insisted on paying, on completing what should have been a simple transaction. Why? She wondered. Why had he done that? The older man who had witnessed the confrontation was now making his way toward the exit, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He paused when he reached the counter and turned to the woman. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, but full of understanding, "sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen, even when we think we've heard enough." She looked up at him, her expression still uncertain, but grateful for the words. "I know," she replied softly. "I didn't mean to judge him like that, but it felt like I was protecting something that felt so wrong." The man gave a gentle nod. "I get it. But sometimes what we think is wrong is just a different perspective. Doesn't make it any easier, though," she sighed, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. "I don't know what I'm supposed to think about all of this. It's like everything is so divided now. It's hard to even know where to start." The older man smiled faintly. "Start by talking without the walls of anger and resentment. That's the only way things get better." She nodded slowly, her mind racing with the truth of what he was saying. Maybe the conversation wasn't over after all. Maybe it had only just begun. As the clock ticked on, the soft sound of the bell above the door jingled once more. Another customer entered, and for the first time that evening, the woman felt a sense of calm, knowing that the store would continue on as it always had. She didn't have all the answers, but she was beginning to understand that the answers weren't as simple as they seemed. Jack had walked in expecting just to buy screws, but in a way, he had left with something far more significant. He had left with the reminder that sometimes, even when we are divided by what we believe, we can find common ground in our willingness to listen. And that, she thought, was something worth holding on to. The woman stood for a moment, reflecting on Jack's departure. The soft glow of the fluorescent lights seemed less harsh now, and the weight of the day felt lighter. She had been holding on to something, her anger, her frustration, her need to be right. Yet in the span of a few minutes, her perspective had begun to shift. Jack had been resolute, but calm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't tried to force her into agreeing with him. He simply spoke his truth. And though it had challenged her, it had also forced her to confront her own. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of the counter, the smooth surface cold against her skin. She had refused to serve him, thinking it was the right thing to do. But the truth was, she had been acting out of fear. Fear of what the hat stood for. Fear of being associated with everything it represented. But what had she really accomplished by refusing him? She had only created more division. As the store's closing time drew near, the quiet of the evening took over, the soft hum of the overhead lights filling the silence. Her eyes scanned the shelves, still organized, still stocked with tools and supplies. This was her life. This store, these people, this small-town community. But it was also a world that felt increasingly fractured. A world where the lines between right and wrong had blurred so much that it was hard to know who the enemy was anymore. The door to the hardware store opened again, and Claire looked up, expecting to see another late-night shopper. But it wasn't a customer. It was the older man from earlier, the one who had spoken up during her confrontation with Jack. He had a kind face, a face that seemed to carry a lifetime of wisdom, but also a deep understanding of the world as it was now. He stopped just inside the door and gave Claire a thoughtful look. "Mind if I come in for a moment?" he asked quietly, his tone almost like an invitation to continue their conversation. Claire nodded, gesturing for him to step inside. "Of course. I wasn't expecting anyone else tonight." He walked over to the counter, settling down on one of the stools with a sigh. "Well, I thought maybe we could talk a little more," he said, his voice steady but gentle. Claire felt the urge to speak, but instead, she simply nodded. She was still sorting through her thoughts, still grappling with the choices she'd made, the conversation she'd had. It wasn't easy to admit that she had made a mistake, but part of her knew it was the first step in something deeper. Maybe this conversation, with him, was another piece of that puzzle. "You know, sometimes it feels like the world's just lost the ability to have an honest conversation," the older man continued, his eyes thoughtful. "Everyone's so caught up in being right, they forget that the most important thing is to listen, to understand." Claire leaned against the counter, her eyes meeting his. "I know," she said softly. "I've been so caught up in how I feel about things that I didn't stop to think about how Jack might feel, or how it might look from his side." The man gave her a knowing look. "It's not easy seeing things from another person's point of view, especially when that person doesn't think like you, doesn't see the world in the same way you do. But that's how we learn. That's how we grow." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I'm ready to fully understand his side. There's a part of me that still feels angry, I guess. Angry about what the hat represents. But I also know it's not just about the hat. It's about him and about what he stands for. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop seeing him through the lens of the symbol he wears." The older man smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had lived through times of division. "It's hard, isn't it? But change doesn't come without discomfort. And sometimes the hardest thing is to acknowledge that we might not have all the answers." Claire nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to the register. She was processing everything she had seen, heard, and felt during the last few hours. It wasn't going to be an easy journey, but for the first time that night, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. She realized that sometimes all it took was one conversation, one moment of vulnerability, to open the door to understanding. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't resolved, but it was a start. "Thank you," she said softly to the older man. "I needed this. I needed to hear that I don't have to be perfect, that I don't have to have all the answers." He smiled warmly at her, standing to leave. "None of us do. But as long as we're willing to try, that's all that matters." As he stepped out the door, the bell chimed softly behind him, signaling his departure. Claire took a deep breath and turned back to the store. The stillness in the air felt different now, less heavy, less oppressive. It felt like the first breath after a storm, the calm that followed the chaos. She looked at the empty space around her, the shelves, the tools, the small-town store that had always felt like home. Maybe things weren't so divided after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope to be found in the simplest of conversations. In the moments when people stopped seeing each other as enemies and started seeing each other as people. Flawed, complicated, but deserving of respect nonetheless. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would take her, but she knew she couldn't keep walking the same path of anger. She had to open herself up to something new, to the possibility of understanding, even when it was uncomfortable. The bell above the door jingled once again as another customer stepped inside. Claire smiled faintly, ready for whatever the next moment would bring. The sound of the bell was a familiar one, and Claire took a deep breath before straightening herself at the counter. A new customer entered the store, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a flannel shirt, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a small town like this. Quiet, unassuming, and with a story that was probably just as simple as his appearance. She gave him a friendly smile, feeling more at ease now than she had earlier. "Can I help you with something?" The man nodded, glancing around the store as he made his way toward the aisle. "Just need a few things for the yard," he said. "Maybe some fertilizer and a rake. Nothing too complicated." Claire nodded, making her way toward the shelves to help him find what he needed. As they walked, her mind continued to replay the events of the day. She had already begun to question her actions, and while Jack was no longer in the store, his presence lingered in her thoughts. As she helped the man gather the supplies he needed, her eyes lingered on the door for a moment. She thought about Jack, the conversation they had, and the quiet lesson that had followed. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully understand everything about the man or his hat, but she had a feeling that she would remember his words for a long time. It was easy to be caught up in assumptions, to see a symbol and immediately place all the meaning behind it without taking the time to understand the person it belonged to. But in this small, quiet store, she had started to realize that sometimes the truth wasn't as simple as the labels we give things. It was about the people who wore those labels and the stories they carried with them. By the time the man was finished and ready to check out, Claire had made peace with her earlier choices. She wasn't perfect. None of them were. But she had learned something today. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than the symbol on a hat. After ringing up his items, Claire smiled at the man again. "Anything else for you today?" He shook his head. "Nope, that's all. Appreciate it." As he left the store, the bell jingled again, and for a moment, the store was still. Claire stood behind the counter, feeling the weight of the day settle into a more peaceful rhythm. She had grown up in this town, and for as long as she could remember, it had always been a place where things felt safe and predictable. But now, things felt different. Less certain, perhaps, but more open. She didn't know what the future held, but she understood now that sometimes just opening the door to a conversation was the first step to making things better. She could start by listening. She could start by opening her mind and seeing the people around her not as symbols, but as individuals with their own stories. For the first time that day, Claire felt a sense of relief. It was a quiet moment, a shift that wasn't dramatic but was still significant. She wasn't sure how to bridge all the divides in the world, but she knew that trying, really trying, was a good place to start. And perhaps that was enough for now. She looked around the store one last time before the door opened again. The world was still out there, still divided, still full of contradictions. But there was also something she hadn't noticed before, the possibility of understanding. And as long as that door remained open, there was always hope. As Claire stood behind the counter, the quiet of the store felt almost soothing. The soft hum of the lights and the distant sound of the occasional car passing outside created a sense of calm, a welcome change from the tension that had gripped the store earlier that day. Her thoughts still lingered on Jack, on the conversation that had taken place, and the unanswered questions that had been left hanging in the air. There was so much more to understand, so much more to discuss. But for now, she felt a flicker of understanding that had been absent before. Her gaze drifted toward the door again, and she found herself wondering if Jack would come back. Would he return to the store the next time he needed something? Would their brief interaction remain a quiet chapter in a much bigger story, or would it be the start of something new? She didn't know, but she couldn't deny the impact it had on her. It wasn't just about the hat. It wasn't just about the political divide, the ideological battles that seemed to dominate the news every day. It was about something deeper, a fundamental misunderstanding that had been built up over time based on symbols, assumptions, and fears. And in that brief moment, that exchange between them, there was a crack in the wall. A chance, however small, for something else to emerge. The door swung open again, this time with a cheerful jingle. A woman, maybe in her early 40s, walked in with a basket of gardening supplies, a friendly smile on her face. Claire offered her a greeting, and as the woman made her way down the aisle, Claire turned her attention back to the register. She couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose, even though the world outside was still messy, still divided. She had no illusions about fixing everything overnight. But the idea of starting small, with a conversation, with simply listening, maybe that was a place to begin. As the woman at the counter finished paying for her items, Claire couldn't help but think about how much she had to learn. The path ahead wasn't simple. Understanding was a slow, painstaking process. But today, Claire had taken one small step, and perhaps that was enough for now. "Thank you for coming in," she said to the woman, handing her the receipt with a smile. "Hope you enjoy the gardening supplies." The woman smiled back. "I will. Thanks, Claire." After the woman left, Claire turned her attention to the register again, looking over the day's sales and organizing the receipts. As the evening wore on, she began to realize how much quieter the store felt now. The tension from earlier in the day had dissipated, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of closing time. Claire wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. The world outside would continue to spin, filled with its divisions and disagreements, its politics and personal beliefs. But inside this small, quiet store, there was room for something else. A chance for people to see one another, not through the labels they wore, but through the shared humanity that connected them all. Claire let out a deep breath, her mind quieter than it had been all day. She hadn't solved the world's problems, she hadn't figured out how to fix everything, but she had taken the first step. And sometimes, that was enough. With that thought, Claire turned off the register and began locking up the store, ready for the night ahead. As Claire locked the front door of the hardware store, she felt the weight of the day finally lift off her shoulders. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the store she had just left behind. She took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air, and let it out slowly. The chaos of the world seemed far away here in her small town, but she knew that, like everyone else, she was part of that world. And the conversation she'd had with Jack had reminded her of that, how the smallest interactions could shape the way we saw each other. She walked to her car, her steps slow and reflective. What had she really learned today? It wasn't just about the MAGA hat or the political divide, though those things were important. It wasn't just about Jack and the difficult conversation they'd shared. It was about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories others carry with them, and how sometimes we get so caught up in our own that we forget to listen to theirs. She slid into the driver's seat and started the car, the engine humming to life. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she couldn't help but think about how Jack's words had resonated with her. We're all just people trying to make sense of it. It was such a simple sentiment, but one that had seemed lost in the noise of the world. She thought about the divisions that had grown deeper, the fear and anger that had crept into so many conversations, and how easy it was to write someone off based on a single detail, like a hat. But today, she had seen Jack for what he truly was, a man with his own story, his own reasons for wearing the hat, and his own pain. She had learned that symbols like the MAGA hat weren't just about politics. They were about what people believed, what they fought for, and what they felt connected to. She had always thought of herself as someone who was open-minded, but today had shown her that being open-minded wasn't just about accepting the things you already agreed with. It was about hearing the other side, even when it was uncomfortable. Her mind wandered as she drove through the quiet streets of the town, past the familiar houses and stores. Her life here was small, simple in many ways, but it was also part of something much larger. And as she made her way home, she realized that she had only just begun to understand what it meant to truly listen, to truly try to see the world from someone else's eyes. Later that evening, as she sat down to dinner, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her sister, Emily. "Hey, I saw the news about that MAGA hat incident at the store today. How's everything? You okay?" Claire's fingers hovered over the screen. She could feel the weight of the question, the expectation for her to explain what had happened, to give her side of the story. It was easy to respond with anger, to explain how she had been justified, how she had refused service to someone who supported something she found harmful. But instead, she paused. She thought about the conversation she'd had, about the realization she'd come to. She typed a response, her fingers moving slowly but surely. "I'm okay. It was a tough day, but I think I learned something important. We're all just trying to understand each other, even when it feels impossible. Maybe I didn't handle everything perfectly, but I'm willing to listen. I hope that counts for something." She stared at the message for a moment before sending it. It wasn't the perfect response, and it didn't solve everything. But it was a start. And that, Claire realized, was enough for now. The next morning, as Claire drove to work, she noticed something different in the world around her. The way the sun lit up the streets, the sound of cars driving by, the voices of people walking past. It all felt just a little more connected. Maybe it was because of the lessons she had learned the day before, or maybe it was simply because, for once, she had allowed herself to see things differently. When she arrived at the store, she was greeted by the usual quiet hum of the morning routine. The store was still empty, save for a few employees getting things ready for the day. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was reminded that things hadn't changed all that much. The world outside might still be divided, but here, inside this store, she had the power to make a difference. It might be small, it might be slow, but it was something. As she started to set up for the day, her thoughts lingered on Jack, wondering if he would ever return. Would he come back to the store? Would he too reflect on their conversation? Claire wasn't sure. But whatever happened, she knew she had learned something valuable. The importance of listening, the value of empathy, and the realization that sometimes, even when we don't agree, we can still find a way to coexist. Her first customer of the day walked in, a middle-aged man she recognized from the neighborhood. He gave her a friendly nod, and she smiled back, ready to face the day with a new perspective. As the day wore on, the store slowly filled with customers, each coming in for their usual supplies, each absorbed in their own little world. But for Claire, the day felt different. She felt a weight lifted off her shoulders, not because she had solved everything, but because she had finally allowed herself to see a situation through someone else's eyes. She knew that there was no easy resolution, no quick fix to the division she saw in the world, but what mattered now was that she was willing to try. She had made the decision to listen, and that, she believed, was the first step. The door chimed once again, signaling another customer entering the store. Claire looked up and saw a familiar face. Jack, the man with the MAGA hat. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she froze. What would happen now? Would there be more tension, more discomfort, or would this be a moment of understanding? Jack didn't immediately approach the counter. Instead, he walked past her, his steps slow and deliberate. He paused near the aisles, picking up a few tools and supplies, as though nothing had changed. But Claire could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure if he had come back for something specific, or if he was simply trying to reclaim the space he had once felt was his. After a few moments, he turned around and made his way back to the counter. This time, his posture was different, softer, almost apologetic. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice steady but lacking the certainty from before. Claire smiled at him, her heart racing a little. "Morning, Jack, how are you?" He nodded, glancing down at the items in his hand. "Better," he said. "A little clearer, I think. I came back for those screws. I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," Claire replied, her voice warm but cautious. She rang up his items, her hands moving automatically, but her mind was elsewhere. On the conversation they had had, on what had brought him back, on what it all meant. Jack paid for his items without a word, and as she handed him the receipt, he paused. "I wasn't trying to make you feel uncomfortable the other day," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't expect everyone to agree with me. I just want people to understand why I wear the hat, why I believe in what I do." Claire nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in. She didn't have all the answers, but she could see now that it wasn't about agreeing with him. It was about hearing his perspective. It was about finding a way to exist in a world full of differences without always needing to be right. "I understand," Claire said softly. "And I think I might have misunderstood you. Not because of your hat, but because of everything I assumed about it." She paused, looking up at him, her eyes sincere. "I've learned that sometimes we need to listen to the people behind the symbols, not just the symbols themselves." Jack smiled faintly, and for the first time, Claire could see something shift in his eyes. "That's all I want," he said. "To be heard." And just like that, the tension between them seemed to dissolve. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, and it didn't fix everything, but it was enough. There was an understanding, a realization that sometimes the answers aren't as important as the willingness to listen. As Jack walked out of the store, Claire watched him go, a strange sense of peace settling over her. The world was still divided, still messy and complicated. But for a brief moment, there had been a connection. A simple exchange of words that hadn't solved all the problems, but had opened the door to something better. Empathy. Claire turned back to the counter and began organizing the day's sales. She knew there was still so much work to do, so much more to understand. But for now, this was enough. She could only take one step at a time, one conversation at a time, and maybe, just maybe, change would come, one small connection at a time. As the door jingled again, signaling the next customer, Claire greeted them with a renewed sense of hope. The day was just beginning, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew that with each new interaction, with each new conversation, she could make a difference. What do you think about Claire's decision to listen to Jack's side of the story? Was it the right choice, or do you think she should have stuck to her beliefs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, please like the video and subscribe for more stories.